astronauts, afterlives, and the science that refuses to die.
On this episode, we have a moonwalking astronaut who connected with the mind of the universe, the surgeon from another world, and the UFO Virgin Mary that healed a chihuahua.
What a lucky chihuahua.
That's actually in there. I found that for us today. We're talking about the afterlife, what happens when we die, and we're not really talking about ghosts and poltergeists, even though I have the shirt on. We're talking about consciousness, right? Aspects of consciousness really is what this gets down to.
But yeah, I mean, you don't think Zach Baggins is the biggest paranormal bully out there?
Oh, well, bully? I mean, yeah, the guy's a bit thuggish, isn't he?
He does seem like he has a particular way with the ghosts.
I wouldn't want him showing up on my doorstep like late at night, right? You answer the door and it's him. No, I would feel intimidated. No. But yeah, so this topic sort of came up partially because I experienced a human ritual that we all share from time to time, where I spent some time in a room with a corpse in a box. I went to a funeral. And, I've had people pass away in my life, loved ones passed away, but never went to an actual funeral where the human meat was there in the wooden box. And I was struck by it. I was like, so this is basically the same as like the wakes and stuff that I've been to before, the ceremonies I've been to before. But the difference is there is that body in the coffin in the room for the viewing, right?
Yeah.
And I was really struck by like, that's what it is. It's human meat. The consciousness is not there. That is not the person that we knew when they were alive.
And where did it go? What happened to it? Is it melded with spirit in some way? Is spirit even a thing?
Yeah, is it spirit? Is it consciousness? And whatever it is, something animates us. We're just kind of these flesh bags, and I don't think it's just electrical signals bouncing around that are keeping us going, like Frankenstein's monster or something.
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's hard to say, and how much that ties in with some of these other experiences that people claim to have, precognitive dreams, remote viewing, things like that. Like how does consciousness and survival of it tie into those sorts of ideas? It's an interesting turn to take that.
Right. Everything we've talked about, it even ties into Bigfoot if you get down
Definitely
to it.
Ties into Bigfoot.
But, one thing's for sure, we're not going to solve the mysteries of consciousness here on this podcast today. But we can talk about some of the people who have been out there doing real research. Some people with like fancy degrees and stuff. Legit scientists look into the topic of consciousness and the science of consciousness, and we'll be covering them and more. But I wanted to mention first, as we sort of run down what we're about to get into, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, former astronaut and sixth person to walk on the moon, badass, also founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is dedicated to consciousness research. So legit person. I mean, this is a human with a job. And he's not just, taking DMT and being like, consciousness is wild, man. But I mean, we'll talk about his story.
It seems like a pretty fun way to go about it, though, too.
Yeah. Hey, yeah. I'm not trying to harsh your vibe, man, out there. But yeah, you got a person or two to talk about, right?
Yeah. Well, unlike the first guy we brought up impromptu, most of these guys seem like they'd be pretty pleasant to chat with and spend an afternoon with. The guy I did most of my research off of was Jeffrey Mishlove, and he's the only person from his understanding, and I didn't follow up on this a bunch, but from his understanding, he's the only person to hold a doctoral diploma in parapsychology, basically in the United States.
That's legit. That is
Yeah.
legit. And of
So
course,
he got
tons of
in at kind
people
of like,
research that field, but PhD, dude. Yeah.
yeah, he got a PhD. He kind of got in at this perfect time where he was able to, talk folks into backing it. And yeah, it was a pretty interesting story. So we'll get into that a little bit later, I think.
And I've always been fascinated by Dr. Ian Stevenson. That's going to be another name that comes up a lot during this episode. And
Mm-hmm.
he is a researcher, a doctor who did extensive research into reincarnation and past life memories. So, if there is life after death, if our consciousness doesn't just dissipate when we die, maybe reincarnation's a thing.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like it's a definite possibility that that's one route or one way to explain some of the aspects of what we experience after death.
Stepping back, it's like the sort of materialist scientific understanding of dying is brain death and the heart stopping, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're dead. No pulse, no brain activity. You died. But anecdotally, there are many cases where that doesn't seem to hold up under scrutiny, right? And
Yeah.
there are near death experiences reported by a lot of people who have been in that state, including, by the way, my mom. My mom almost died. And when, she did die. Her heart stopped. All those signs that, you would say someone is dead. She did
Mm-hmm.
recover. She's doing great. She's got the care she needs. And what didn't come up until I told her about this episode that we're recording is that she had her own NDE.
Really.
And it's nothing too complex. It's not a long story, but it does differ from a typical NDE in a couple ways. She said that when she was on the other side, she was in a place of love and acceptance just through and through. But she said her loved ones weren't there. There weren't people there greeting her. That sort of like, your family, your dead relatives at the end of a tunnel beckoning you. It
Yeah.
was just that she had basically transcended into a place of love and acceptance. And
Interesting.
she said it wasn't really a visual experience as well. Just an experience she had in the
Mm-hmm.
in between.
Yeah, there's a guy who I know who had kind of an overdose situation, and he was out for a while and brought back, and he had kind of a similar thing where it was similar to what we hear about, but just like not as spectacular as most of the
Right.
bigger stories you hear very often.
It wasn't Robin Williams in What Dreams May Come. It wasn't even the movie Ghost.
Yeah. But yeah, it's also interesting. I just kind of wanted to touch on one other thing real quick. How it kind of even ties into some of the last episode we were doing.
Yeah.
And I wanted to mention the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies, because the Jeffrey Mishlove, he wrote the award-winning essay for them, and it was.
And that's Bigelow Aerospace, the big boy Bigelow, the guy who owns the Skinwalker Ranch.
Yes, got to complete my thoughts for me. Exactly, the guy who he was studying UFOs, and now he's more into just kind of consciousness and how that ties into everything as well. So it's kind of interesting that it even ties back to our last subject, which was, felt completely different than this, but so many people tie the two together in an interesting way.
And just for
So
good measure, I found a case where UFOs are involved in in this topic as well. I specifically went looking for that. But so that's what you're in store for, is to strap in. And we'll get into it currently, right? So we're mentioning these big names, the scientists who take the question seriously. I've already brought up Dr. Edgar Mitchell. And like I said, he was an astronaut and he did walk on the moon. We really have walked on the moon. Okay?
I don't know.
Maybe we'll revisit that another time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so suppose if you believe that we've walked on the moon, we'll bench that. But this would have been the 6th guy to walk on the moon in 1971, and it was Apollo 14. And on the way back from the moon, he had an experience. He had a realization that everything in the universe, including human life, was connected at the most fundamental level. And this is a quote from Edgar Mitchell. During the return trip to Earth, I had the overwhelming sense that the universe is intelligent, that there is a connectedness between all things. I experienced what has been described as samadhi, an ecstasy of unity. I knew then that the universe was not just a random occurrence, but that it was intelligent. I realized that the story of ourselves as told by science, our cosmology, our understanding of the universe was incomplete. There had to be more to reality than what we were taught. And regardless of what you believe, I feel like that's fair. We don't spend a lot of time really discussing the nature of consciousness from a societal standpoint. When you're growing up, your mom's not like, now it's time to talk about consciousness,
Yeah.
Usually.
Well,
typically.
and he's, as an astronaut, more than likely coming from like the material science side of things. And so to get all kind of metaphysical with it and like we are all one, kind of idea is interesting. And he, it almost just sounds like so many of these stories, like, a download or something. And it was just kind of a light switched on for him.
Little Stephen Greer-ish even, but yeah, but in this case, right, he was in space. He was physically in space and had this realization, which has been sort of echoed by other astronauts. Some people refer to the overview effect, which is just the understanding of basically the connectedness and fragility of the planet. But it seems like he went a little further than that. And so it was just 2 years after returning from the moon, Edgar Mitchell founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, known as IONS, IONS, in 1973. And his goal was to create a scientific organization dedicated to studying consciousness, human awareness, and the possibility that the mind extends beyond the physical brain. And that's some fringe stuff. This is, again, just 2 years later he founded this. So it's like, he did his victory lap. He's like, I was on the moon, and then bam, got down to business. And this research took him through the rest of his life. I mean, so IONS supported research into some of the most unusual aspects of human experience, including meditation, psychic perception, healing, near-death experiences, and altered states of consciousness. And their work focused on whether thoughts, intention, and awareness could influence the physical world, and whether consciousness might continue even after clinical death. And he always maintained it wasn't a spiritual pursuit. Scientific. That's where he wanted to approach this from.
That's interesting because like it does sound like such a spiritual
It does.
experience up there that he had. And so I mean, but maybe just to kind of keep its credibility, he wanted to
I think
approach
that's
it just
the
more
case more
straight.
than
Yeah.
anything. Yeah, absolutely. PhD scientist, an astronaut, he's looking for like quantifiable evidence, you know.
Yeah, for sure.
Something we
Aren't
can
we all?
agree on. Yeah. And
Definitely.
so he didn't stop with ions either. He co-founded Quantrek. He co-founded it with physicist Richard Amoroso to study consciousness as a physical force in the universe, focusing on quantum theory, suggesting that the brain may function as a receiver of consciousness rather than its source. And, you know, I've heard this described in different ways, like your brain is the radio receiving the transmission, the radio transmission.
Mm-hmm.
Or we're being projected onto, or consciousness is being projected onto us. I kind of like, well, for one, right? I've said this, but I'll say it again. I'll say it each episode. I don't know how much of anything I believe. Like, I have some closely held beliefs, but I really try to leave it open because I don't have the proof. There isn't the smoking gun. But the more I think about this concept and internalize it, I feel like there's something to this. Like the idea that I'm not my thoughts, I'm the awareness of my thoughts. There's that meta
Mm-hmm.
layer. And it's
Yeah.
like to be the receiver of consciousness seems to make sense in a lot of ways to me.
Well, I mean, and it's hard to understand exactly how all that works. Yeah, I mean, it could make sense, and it is also interesting to think about like the quantum entanglement ideas, where if these
Yes.
two, you know, atoms or whatever are created in the same environment, you can manipulate them from vast distances, and it kind of is like an instantaneous communication where they react in the same way based off of the other's interaction. And you know, I mean, that, you know, may be a like a similar concept to how to talk about that kind of a tuning in. Or
If you
yeah,
can't explain it, quantum.
that's, hey, that's it. That's it.
Right?
I only need a couple of them qubits.
It's like Ant-Man in the quantum verse or whatever. So just one, this is kind of a departure, a little bit of a tangent, but it still relates back to Edgar Mitchell and his research. And I really wanted to go into this because I found this story in American Cosmic by Pasulka, which was a book I actually picked up for our last episode and didn't really get into it. Diana Walsh Pasulka, American Cosmic, UFOs, Religion, and Technology, right? So later in life, Mitchell co founded FREE, the Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Encounters. And the goal was to collect large scale scientific data from people who claimed encounters with non human intelligence, near death experiences, and other extraordinary events. But, right, the origin story of FREE is kind of a wild one. And it starts with Ray Hernandez and his wife, Dulce. Dulce Hernandez, Ray, they had a 16-year-old Jack Russell Terrier named Nina. I said Chihuahua in the intro. It's a Jack Russell Terrier. Close enough, right? But so 16 years old, that's old for a dog. Paralyzed from a cerebral hemorrhage, and they were going to have to euthanize the dog the following day. So, like a good Catholic, Dulce was praying to God, asking for angels to cure the dog. Right? So, that night, Dulce carried the paralyzed dog downstairs, where she saw in their house a metallic object floating about 4 feet off the ground, shaped like an upside down U. The object had 2 ring-shaped lights in the center. And like a good Catholic, she, of course, assumed this was the Virgin Mary. You know, floating metallic object must be the Virgin
Yeah,
Mary.
that is crazy and kind of goes back so much to what we talked about last time, where it's like it just like interpretation in these
Yes.
different
The
ways
lens you
of
view it
these
through.
event.
Yeah.
And it's hard, like some of them, like it's hard to take what they say and not think it's a UFO, but there's other ones that take a little more interpretation. But like this one here, it's even a more modern event, but still this person sees something that I would never equate to being the Virgin Mary, if it is what they describe. And maybe it's more than that. Maybe there's some, kind of psychic intuition that like is imprinted in your brain instead of the
Right.
actual what you're actually seeing. But
That's a
yeah.
great point, and I think there's a lot to that. But that said, she did describe it as this metallic object, and part of why I point that out is because Ray did come downstairs. She's praying to this object floating in their living room. Ray comes downstairs and he saw something, but what he saw was different than what she saw. He saw a plasma like cylindrical object, approximately 2 to 3 feet wide and about 2 feet tall, multicolored and translucent, appeared to be made of pure energy. And there's some real weird aspects of this interaction that sort of line up with like UFO encounters or abduction experiences, just where he sees this thing, and despite his wife freaking out and this thing floating in his house, he decides to walk back upstairs, lie down in bed, and try to go back to sleep. And so that's described in a lot of like abduction experiences. It's like, oh, there's little gray men in my room. I might as well go back to sleep.
Yeah, I'm
That
tired.
sort of thing. Yeah. But right in the end, spoiler alert, I guess we're already there. They cured the dog. The dog was cured. The Virgin Mary cured the dog. The metallic Virgin Mary.
Praise Jesus.
It says the dog was running around energetically, behaving like a puppy again.
Yeah.
Now, I had to include that because of how bizarre that is. But what is even weirder to me is what that led to. Is so he got obsessed. Ray started researching all these topics, and a story for a different show is he started seeing more and more UFOs. Sort of that pile-on effect.
Really?
Where
Yeah.
he said he saw giant UFOs the size of a blimp. But the point here is that he started reaching out to researchers, and Mary Rodwell connected with him and took him seriously and connected him with astrophysicist Rudy Schild, right? Who then connected him to Edgar Mitchell. And so this crew of people put together FREE, the what was the acronym? It is FREE stands for the Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Encounters, right? And it's legit as legit can be. The FREE Foundation says that it performed the largest scale study into people reporting encounters with non-human intelligence. Thousands of participants from around the world, different languages, different religions. They cracked it. They figured it all out. Now, I don't know what exactly the result of their research was, but it's cool to know that all came from essentially like a UFO encounter in someone's living room.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that might be something interesting to look into as well. Because that was kind of one of the reasons why I decided to read what I read for this. Because a few years ago, the Bigelow Institute for consciousness studies, which kind of like as your story pointed out, like people who are interested in this topic, they kind of revolve around each other, and it seems like they're all like kind of loosely connected. Because I know like Jeffrey Mishlove has worked with the ions
Yeah.
group that you had talked about, and so it seems like a lot of these people are, and I would be surprised if a lot of the people you have didn't submit essays to this contest that Bigelow had.
There's like a Rolodex somewhere that they all share. We've all
Yeah.
got each other's numbers. Yeah. But what about this
Yeah.
essay contest? Tell me about this essay
Yeah.
contest.
So the essay contest was pretty cool. So the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies, it's Bigelow. He had Bass for a while. It was Bigelow Aerospace, and they were making those inflatable living situations for the space. And
Which are super cool. They've tested
yeah.
those. Like, yeah.
And I forget it. I haven't looked into it recently if that's still going forward. I think that may have been canceled, but yeah. Anyway, he's more interested. Robert Bigelow is more interested in this consciousness studies stuff now. And so he put, it's like a whole institute or whatever, but they gave away $1.8 million, almost $2 million in prizes.
For an essay
And
contest.
Yeah. So in 2021, they had an essay contest. It was a massive global endeavor. It began with 1,300 applications from all continents, and it resulted in a final submission of 204 essays, each with up to 25,000 words. So from 38 countries. There was
That is
seven outstanding experts who decided the 29 winners, and they gave away almost $2 million in prizes. Let's see here. This is their beautiful website.
Bigelow.
But they had,
yeah.
The contest judges. Yeah. But there's a lot of people here who you kind of recognize. Leslie Keene,
Hal
Jeffrey
Puthoff
Kripal, Hal Puthoff. So there's a lot of people. Chris Green. These are names you see in these sort of topics all the time. And it's just interesting kind of how they revolve around each other. And so one of the, let's see here. Yeah. Anyway, one of the folks that entered into the contest is Jeffrey Mishlove. And he, like I said, was the only person to hold a doctoral diploma in parapsychology from the University of California, Berkeley, or any other accredited American university. He was studying criminology, but in 1972, he kind of had a origin story type event.
Okay.
He was sleeping, and so it was like early-ish in the morning. And so 1972, basically his uncle came to him in a dream. He talks about, so it was like early on the East Coast, his uncle, or in Wisconsin, his uncle went to mass or the synagogue and came back and apparently died peacefully in his chair. But this guy, Jeffrey Mishlove, is studying in California, and he gets visited by his uncle in this dream. And his uncle says a couple things to him, and one of the ones that was interesting that he pointed out was that he didn't maybe necessarily like his attitude towards women, and like I think the other guy was more like secular Jewish, and the uncle, and so he's kind of wishing that he would kind of continue on those traditions, but it was the early 70s, and I feel like he was maybe a little bit more progressive in California.
Was into that Shix appeal. He had the fever.
So yeah, Jeffrey was sleeping in California, and he just had the most powerful dream of his life, he says. His uncle came to him, and he had some criticism about his attitude towards women. And he also shared some symbology. And he said it was something like the yin-yang symbol. And if you look at his logo, because he has run a couple like interview style shows on
Yeah,
YouTube
that's really
and
where I
other
know him
places.
from, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's called Thinking Aloud or New Thinking Aloud, but he has kind of this yin yang symbol, but it's like all like kind of tie dye colored. It's pretty interesting. But I kind of wonder if that's kind of his best representation
Right.
of what he saw in that dream. So he awoke crying and he was singing this powerful song, Avinu Malakenu. And then he contacted home. I guess he wrote his mom and just kind of inquired about his uncle. And she got the letter and called him right up and was, basically like, "Oh my gosh, Jeffrey, how did you know? Your uncle
Ah.
died last weekend."
So it's
You
one of
know?
those cases where, yeah, he's visited by the departed without knowing they're actually dead.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah. And so then they talk about the estimated times and he figures it must have been like near the exact moment he died. And so he asked for something to remember his uncle by. Just something that he could have to remember his uncle by. And so he was given this book, and I think it was in Hebrew, and so he couldn't read it. I think
And
he
this is like
eventually
a
did.
metaphysical book, like he was given this in this
Well, that's
altered
yeah. It
state.
basically no. This is this is an actual book. After he contacts his mom, they're like
Gotcha. Right.
he's
Okay.
like, "Hey, give me one something from Uncle. I want to remember him." And she's like, "Okay," and so they give him his favorite book, but it does turn out to be like heavily rooted in the mysticism and kind of these ideas that tie into, afterlife communication as we're talking about. It was here, I've got it right here. Yeah, it became more apparent. So the uncle was an Orthodox Jew and turns out was very interested in the more mystical teachings of that religion. This became more apparent when Jeffrey was given his uncle's favorite book. It was a book about the 18th century rabbi and miracle worker Israel Baal Shem Tov, who founded the Jewish Hasidic tradition.
Ah.
And so this whole dream and experience inspired Jeffrey Mishlove to pursue this field.
That's cool, but I would have like preferred getting like his Camry. Like, let me get Unc's car. I mean, a book is cool.
I know he took good care of that thing. Just
Yeah, exactly.
Cutlass Supreme.
Took it to the dealership anytime there was a noise.
Yeah, so he does.
That was from that was detailed in his essay that he turned into this contest. Is that right?
This essay, I feel like it's like 97 pages. So, you could call it an essay or you could call it a short book.
Novella.
But it's got a lot of videos, links, and it's got a lot of because he's had so many interviews with people that, like, if you wanted a primer for this subject, I feel like this is a great one. It's pretty interesting, all the little overviews of everything he gives. So yeah, he does talk about his personal story and how to get into it. But one of the things that I found really interesting before we kind of dive into the topics here is this thing that he calls let me pull it up here. What is it? The spectrum of arrows. And so this is all evidence of what he feels like is some of the best evidence for survival after death here.
Okay.
And so near-death experiences, after-death communications, reincarnation, peak Indarian experiences,
I saw
possession,
that there.
instrumental transcommunication, xenoglossy, and that's when you know a language that you don't actually know or you've never
Yes.
learned. Mental mediumship and physical mediumship. I didn't read this one is a weird title and I forget what the peak and Darium experiences are.
But yeah, with xenoglossy, that also overlaps with possession, where someone say
Mm-hmm.
like speaking a dead tongue while they're in a possessed state. But all those
Yeah.
things cross over, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So these are all some of the big things that he touches on every single one of these topics in this essay and has some like the best cases. And so it's just kind of it's it's dense and it's kind of fast hitting where it's just like a couple of the bullet points from each thing and going on to the next one, and the videos provide more context. But yeah, it's pretty interesting read here. And I knew that essay contest had gone on, but I'd never looked into it before. So when we talked about this topic, I was like, oh, this would be a perfect reason to actually read one of these essays.
Hell yeah.
And so
97
they're
page
out there.
essay. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. They're out there available on the website. There's three main winners. He won $500,000 for
Whew.
his. I think the other ones were 250,000 for second and third, and then it kind of drops down from there. But even some of the other ones, it was like it was pretty good for. But
Should
a
we?
lot of these folks too have dedicated their lives to this research, so it's hard to really put any kind of price tag on some of that. But
True. Just, 30 years experience, you get $500,000. Like,
yeah,
could have got that at Wendy's. No. um, but yeah, so like you were shown in that graph, like all of these overlapping, you know, pieces of this puzzle of human consciousness and like the persistence of consciousness past the point of physical death. There is a lot to this whole phenomenon, loosely collected into the idea of the NDE, right? The near death experience. And
absolutely.
something about that before we dive too far in, right? The near death experience as like a phenomena has been talked about for the entirety of human history, right? But the term near death experience came from Raymond Moody in about 1975, published Life After Life, which included the term near death experience. And that was something he published from like a medical scientific standpoint. But right, backing up again, I was like, let's cover some topics for a podcast and try to make it punchy and interesting. So I dove into an absolute gigantic compendium of dense information, like you were talking about. Like perfect podcast show fodder. We got this book I got here is The Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, 30 Years of Investigation, published in 2009. And this is like, I'm still, that said, glad I went into this, right? Because this isn't just one person's work in the subject. This was edited by 3 people, pulling from all sorts of researchers in the field. So this was edited by Janice Minor Holden, a counseling professor and longtime researcher, Bruce Grayson, one of the most influential scientific researchers on NDEs, and creator of the widely used Grayson NDE scale. And also Debbie James, an editor and researcher involved in organizing and presenting major NDE research findings. And like I said, they pull from like a bunch of different sources to put this together. And so obviously not going to give you an exhaustive rundown of everything that's in this book, but we'll talk about the hits, right? They go into the history of NDE research, and the fact that reported NDEs really started to skyrocket in conjunction with improvements in 20th century resuscitation technology. You know, when we were able to start saving more people from the brink of death, more people started reporting NDEs,
Mm-hmm.
which makes
Interesting.
sense. We're
Yeah.
getting better at pulling people back, you know, and get to hear what the hell's going on the other side occasionally.
Yeah. Well, and at times in history too, we would just bury them alive, basically,
Yeah.
so it wasn't,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, we would Edgar Allan Poe them for sure. But so okay, this book goes into it. One thing that I liked about this book is looking just at like the structure of the book gives you an overview sense of how like the entire field of NDEs is researched by the experts. They present
Mm-hmm.
a very clear case out of like this giant swath of information, you know. So they go into the features, circumstances, and incidents of pleasurable NDEs. So putting that distinction on pleasurable NDE versus, traumatic NDEs.
Yeah.
That comes later.
Features is also an interesting term. I
Right.
mean, I guess it makes sense, but it just like when I first hear it, that's not I feel like that's not the word I would go for initially. I don't know.
It's like searching for those common aspects of each
Yeah.
experience, the features, like, but you're thinking like, 4-wheel drive and like, no,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
More.
Is this trail rated? No. So, but yeah, it talks about what people commonly report seeing, hearing, and feeling during these events. And there's, of course, recurring elements of that also cross over with out of body experiences. But there's encounters with light, altered time perception, emotional peace. That's another one that gets reported a lot, sort of like my mom's
Mm-hmm.
experience. She was completely at peace on the other side, just like knowing that she didn't have to worry anymore. And which, by the way, has like eliminated her fear of death. Like, that is another part coming up later, the after effects of pleasurable
Yeah.
NDEs. But so again, this is a huge compendium of information. I wanted to pull out some of the juicy bits, some of the stories that we can turn into YouTube shorts. And so we got to have stories, right? And so, like, in this case, it's the standard one, but it's worth mentioning. In this one documented case, and a lot of these are anonymous. Some of them have the full information, but a lot of them are just pulled from research where it's, anonymous people
Mm-hmm.
reporting this. But one documented case described a man who arrived at the hospital in critical condition, unconscious and turning blue from lack of oxygen. Dead. Medical staff rushed him into emergency treatment where he remained comatose during resuscitation procedures. But after recovering a week later, the patient reported detailed memories of events that had taken place while he had been unconscious. And so and according to the research account, the patient later was able to describe accurately various circumstances occurring during the ensuing resuscitation procedures in the hospital. And the hospital staff confirmed what had been done and what he witnessed was accurate. At the time, he was medically unresponsive. So that's the template, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah, I love those stories where they talk about just, something like the color of the nurse's shirt, or if they really get out of body, some shoes on the hospital roof, or,
right.
some of these other just any kind of thing where they can,
And
and then
even
people can come back and
the use of this medical technology that they wouldn't necessarily have any familiarity with, because we've all seen the
Yeah.
cliches like the crash cart and like whatever else, but there's a lot that goes on that we don't see. We're not trained medical professionals, and we wouldn't know the steps to take, when trying to
Hmm.
resuscitate someone like that. But yeah, that sort of verifiable information is what really keeps people coming back to this from a scientific standpoint. If it was just like, oh, I went to you know, I went to a cloud and there was God there, people wouldn't like
Yeah.
be going back to this decades and decades later, trying to
Well,
really pick it apart. Yeah.
and as you're kind of saying, there's just been so many cases. I mean, do you, how many cases do they even cover in that book?
I have no
Like,
idea. There's a
it's probably a
lot,
ton.
a
Yeah, it's
lot,
probably a ton. It seems like
dozens,
that.
if not more. Like,
Yeah.
is there are full on like tables, like correlating different experiences. So if you were to include like all of that sort of statistical information, yeah,
Yeah.
hundreds of
Well,
cases.
so there was this guy that gets touched on in what I read, and his name is Pin van Lommel. He's a Dutch cardiologist and author, and he describes he calls them controlled studies involving patients who have experienced cardiac arrest in hospital settings. And so he's got 5 independent studies. They involve 562 cases, and nearly 10 to 20%, or I think it was between 10 to 20%, reported an NDE. And so it's like with the heart stopping and the brain stopping, yeah, you wouldn't think that there would be consciousness available to these folks after that, but
Keep
it's
that in mind. That 10 to 20%. We'll
really
get
okay.
we'll get to that a little later too, and
Yeah.
that's a huge amount though, isn't it? Like, yeah.
Yeah.
And but yeah, like I was talking about with my mom, like she no longer is, she has very little fear of death. Like she knows that like something on the other side is waiting for her. She's confident about that. That's chapter 3, after effects of pleasurable near death experiences. And there's more than just that. There's reduced fear of death, increased compassion, profound shifts in values. Um, you know, that sort of is also like, sort of movie cliche, like, oh, you know, like, is it still Christmas Day? Then there's still time. We can make a
Mhm.
difference. We can change our lives. But the experience when you dig into them are pretty wild, like this one, right? So one case described a man known for violent and abusive behavior who experienced a near-death episode during a medical crisis. During his experience, he reported encountering overwhelming feelings of peace and acceptance, followed by what he interpreted as a moral reckoning. After recovering, the man dramatically changed his behavior, abandoning his violent lifestyle and becoming noticeably more compassionate. And researchers cited this case specifically because it contradicted assumptions about personality predicting outcomes. The man had previously been a physically abusive prostitution solicitor, pimp, right? Yet after the NDE, he reformed his behavior and relationships. He stopped pimping. He he uh he let his hose loose after that, dude.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
I wonder what that looks like. He just wakes up the next day and he's just like, I just can't be living like this.
it's like uh it's like when you try to like, release your dog and they like won't leave the house. It's like, you're free now. Was that insensitive? So we'll skim through some of this stuff, but man, there's distressing near death experiences, right? There certainly is that other side. Like, you always hear about the positive ones, you always hear about the
Hmm.
positive NDEs, but there are traumatic, distressing ones. some individuals describe entering states dominated by isolation, anguish, terror, and guilt. But again, these don't really correlate with the life experience. It's not like the pimp like had a distressing case, and
Yeah.
it's not like if you have a distressing NDE that means you're a bad person, which is shown by this one case, right? Is a 5-year-old boy reported a terrifying near-death experience that included imagery traditionally associated with the devil. It's a frightening figure that he interpreted as the devil.
And
And
there was that preacher guy in Georgia semi recently. I forget the details, but like he reported kind of coming back and
right, some man
seeing
of
fires
God,
of brimstone, I think.
like,
Yeah.
who got to see hell when he
Mm-hmm.
briefly, sort of had his foray into the afterlife. But yeah, so like, you'd think like a 5-year-old boy, it hasn't like built up like that sort of negative karma to have to like go see Satan in the
Yeah.
afterlife. But and he wasn't like this like antisocial, like, misanthropic kid or anything like that. But that does tie into like the idea that there are some differences between like the near death experience in children and in adults. Um, like what this book argues is that there are actually really strong similarities in the core elements of near death experiences for kids. Um, Almost more tightly defined than the experiences for adults. Um, so in several documented cases, children reported encountering unfamiliar people during their NDEs whom they believed were relatives. At the time, they did not recognize the individuals. Years later, after seeing old family photographs, some identified those same individuals as deceased relatives they had never previously met. So, anecdotal, you got to take their word for it, but still fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And there's it goes on to talk about like the characteristics of near death experiencers that really there isn't a correlation between like the core group of people experiencing near death experiences, so that it cuts across all demographics of people. There are children, there are adults, men, women, different countries, different religions, all reporting NDEs.
Mm-hmm.
They sometimes get viewed through like a religious lens and all of that. But it says that the data suggested that most hypothesized predictors are not reliable. They don't fucking know. They don't know who's going to have an NDE or not.
Mm-hmm.
But so you mentioned the researcher reporting 10 to 20% like return on like people experiencing
Yeah.
NDEs at death, right? Well, this is interesting. They do. That said, outside of the fact that you can't predict who's going to have a near death experience, this book does go into non-Western near death experiences and the particular aspects of those outside of the Western world,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the core aspects of those. And there's similarities and differences. And so this is one. Check this out. One major study examined survivors of a large earthquake in China who had been medically close to death. Researchers carefully evaluated survivors using standardized criteria to determine whether they had experienced NDEs. Out of those studied, 32 survivors, about 40% reported clear near-death experiences. And so it goes on to say this percentage was notably higher than rates typically reported in Western medical studies. So you go to China, all of a sudden that percentage jumps.
Yeah.
And maybe it wasn't just that, maybe it wasn't that it was just like an aspect of Chinese society. Maybe it was that event in particular. It's so hard to say, right? Like, was there
Yeah.
something about that, you know, earthquake that, like, yeah, created that experience in 40% of the people?
Yeah, that event in particular, or I mean, also like the cultural factors. I think that even, maybe it doesn't, just like a belief in reincarnation or something like that. That I think that would cause it to go up a little bit higher as well. But it also that being more prominent in your cultural background, maybe that would make you more likely to report on something like that, or
Or a
also,
broader acceptance would, like, prevent sort of like the ridicule factor that happens a lot, right? People aren't going to be
yeah,
as worried just to even
yeah.
report it. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally get you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess this is back to back for me, but what about reincarnation, right?
Mhm.
Reincarnation as a concept or a belief isn't limited to like one demographic either. Like, we think of it as, say, like Buddhist reincarnation, but reincarnation, that idea is shared by religions and different people in different countries. Even, shocker, Christianity. There is, part of the Christian dogma is that
Mhm.
reincarnation happened to one guy in particular. But yeah. So, but I mentioned at the start of the show Ian Stevenson, and Dr. Ian Stevenson, always been fascinated by what I've heard of him on other podcasts, honestly. And so now that I'm a guy with a podcast, I decided I got to look it up for myself. But yeah, Dr. Ian Stevenson was involved in reincarnation research, but he was a Western trained psychiatrist known for investigating cases that many scientists avoided. Born in 1918 in Montreal, he eventually became the chair of psychiatry at the University of Virginia. And in that role, his research focus shifted to young children who claimed to have memories of past lives. And that led him to do actual boots on the ground field research across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and the Americas. So the entire planet. He documented thousands of cases. And in 1966, he published his landmark book, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. That's the one that a lot of people point to. And for the sake of time, right, we're not going to cover 20 cases. There's the one banger, dude, that I've also, again, heard before on other shows. But this case, man, was wild. Was Swarnlata Mishra was born in 1948 in Madhya Pradesh, India. At around age 3, she began speaking about a previous life as a woman named Bia Pathak from the town of Katni, about 100 miles away. She described specific details about Bia's home, her family, and lifestyle, including the layout of her house, hidden money kept in the home, and the names of relatives and acquaintances. Swarnlata also demonstrated behaviors unusual for her family, including singing songs from the Katni region, displaying preferences for foods and customs unfamiliar to her parents. So now, right, when the researchers arranged a meeting with the Pathak family, Swarnlata reportedly recognized family members without introduction, correctly identified individuals and relationships and referred to Bia's husband as her own. It's like, oh yeah, my husband. What's up, guy?
That
Miss
is
me?
wild. Like, can you imagine having a little kid come up
Dude.
to you like that? Be like,
It's like, you're 5, kid. You know?
yeah. It's like, I don't know. But no, those stories are crazy. And yeah, I remember hearing some, where it's like they'll start correcting their mother on how to make a specific dish, and it'll
Yes.
be that they want these particular spices added that aren't from their,
And
currently home region.
and India is a great place to point to for all of that because it's so regionally specific. You know, how one dish
Mhm.
is made in one part of India isn't going to be the same, you know,
Mhm.
100 miles away. And again, this is 1948. So this girl wasn't like Googling people and assuming their life's details, and most likely was not even like wouldn't have access to like a newspaper with like an obituary, you know, with any of this
Yeah.
information. But of course the granular detail went way beyond just like reading a blurb about someone who died like, you know,
Mhm.
100 miles away. But really weird, really fascinating. All that stuff was meticulously documented at the time. Um, but it was the 60s, and I don't know what it is that like makes me doubt cases from that long ago, because it's like, are modern day cases really more reliable, right? But you can kind of be like, oh, it was 1966 when he put this book out, it's about a case from like 48, like who knows, you know, like. But that's why I wanted to also just dip into one of his other books that's a lot more recent, 1997. So that still was 30 years ago, basically, right?
Mhm.
But still, it's like the 90s. Like there is the internet in 97.
Mhm.
We're in the modern age at that point. But in 1997, Ian Stevenson published Reincarnation and Biology, which was his move to physical evidence for reincarnation. And it's massive. Again, another tome that I'm dipping into, but they're 2 huge volumes, hundreds of cases. But a lot of it comes down to children born with unusual birthmarks or physical defects. The implication being that these things correspond to fatal wounds from their past lives.
Mhm.
And when available, cases were backed by medical records, autopsy reports, and eyewitness accounts. And so again, what are we even talking about here? This is the big one, the banger, right? Is the case of Ma Tin Aung Myo. Probably butchered that. That's from Myanmar, right? So Ma Tin was born in Myanmar with 2 unusual birthmarks on his head. One birthmark was located at the back of his head and another at the front of the head, suggesting a path passing through the skull. From an early age, the boy began speaking about a previous life as a soldier. He claimed that in life he had been shot in the head during a conflict. So it's like the entry and exit wound from his past life.
Yeah.
So, why does this matter? Because Stevenson investigated the case and located records of a deceased soldier whose injuries matched the child's statements. According to documentation, the soldier had died from a gunshot wound, entered at the back of the head, exited through the front. Stevenson compared the placement of the child's birthmarks, the medical and eyewitness records of the soldier's death, and statements made by the child about his prior life, and it all corresponded. Um, so he, there's photographs in the book, medical style documentation, and all of that. And that's just one case. There's a lot in there. And some really fucking weird ones, I gotta say. So
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, like the ones where the kids have kind of a fear of something based off of whatever happened to
that's
them,
right.
like,
Like it's
afraid of water, or, talk obsession with planes, if, they're pilots, or, something like
it's
that.
become like behavioral. Yeah. This is
Hmm.
just off the top of the head, but there's like cases where like kids know way too much about like specific like naval encounters, naval skirmishes, and like the details of like,
Yeah.
ships that were like taking part in World War II, like naval skirmishes, and like it all checks out. It's like, where did this kid get this information? Um, but so like one thing I just wanted to point out is that like aside from reincarnation, part of what Ian Stevenson's work is getting at is that consciousness plays a fundamental role in shaping our physical bodies. So even the consciousness of another person can shape the way we manifest physically. The
Hmm.
idea that someone else in a past life can now physically affect how I manifest in my life.
Yeah.
Um, and there are some weird cases in this book documented about stuff like this. Like, uh, so in a modern medical case, this is modern at the time, right? A pregnant teenager was repeatedly cursed by her mother, who angrily warned that the baby would be born without arms and legs and blind. So I don't know about the relationship there. It doesn't sound very nurturing, but when the
Thanks,
child,
Mom.
yeah, thanks. When the child was born, both legs were absent and one arm was only partially formed. Okay. Physicians reported that none of the usual causes for birth defects, such as alcohol or genetic factors, could be identified in the pregnancy. Cursed. The mom
That well,
cursed the unborn baby. Dude.
that's interesting to think about, but also could it be the other way? Could that have already been how it was meant to be, and mom just foresaw it in another way? Maybe
And then
she
maybe
had.
that's an example of like foresight, premonition, psychic premonition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and there's
Precognitive.
some of the cases in my booklet there were talking about kind of permission cases where a kid or soul consciousness from somebody will come to the pregnant mom and be like, yo, what's up, can I get in that baby?
That's right.
And like, and sometimes if the mom says no, they'll like be like, okay, then I guess I'll go find another one.
Yeah.
But there was one case where like it came to the mom said no, but then it goes to the dad, and they're like, and the dad's like, yeah, I think that'd be sweet. And so they got in. They only had to have permission from one of the parents, so
It's like, dog, back off. Her body, her choice. She can choose who to manifest, like what
he's,
reincarnated soul is going to manifest.
yeah. He's like, I don't got to deal with you for at least 9 months.
Yeah,
So
yeah, right.
go ahead, get on in there. But no,
Get
it
on
was
in
like
there.
the consciousness that was coming to them was familiar. It was like a friend or like somebody they knew. I forget the exact details, but it was like closer related to them. It wasn't just some rando.
But I do love that idea of like some random person walking up and just asking if they can be born
Just,
into you.
yo, what's up?
Yeah.
Can I
Let
get
me
in that
holler.
baby?
Yeah. But yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to cover with Ian Stevenson. And clearly, like with any of these things I've talked about, there's way more information to dip back into. But I really wanted to get his name and his work out there because there's, regardless of what you believe about it, there's like more than just hearsay out there. There's
Mm-hmm.
some evidence to suggest that maybe reincarnation is happening, and on a sort of a smaller scale than you might imagine. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then kind of like piggyback off of, what we were actually just talking about there is with the reincarnation, if consciousness and is able to live outside of the human body and then get back into it either via reincarnation or possibly choosing somebody who's fully grown and coming back into them, like taking over their body. I've heard it referred to sometimes as walk-ins. Have you ever
Yes.
heard that term? Yeah, where
Yeah,
sometimes where they
absolutely.
talk about like another consciousness kind of walking into your body, and that was kind of some of the cases I wanted to get into, where it's a little bit, it can be darker, but it's not,
There's a
not
killer
doesn't
H.P.
always have to be.
Lovecraft story about that. About a walk-in where it's like,
Really?
yeah, a guy's ancestor takes over his body. Um,
Does
like,
he is he and he slowly comes to the realization that
yeah,
he's
there's like a battle back and forth, but like eventually the grandfather fully takes over like the grandson's body.
nice. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's possession and replacement reincarnation, and that could be described as when a deceased person's spirit enters someone else's body. It can be temporary or permanent. And one of the big cases that I've heard covered before is this interesting one from 1889-ish, and it's what's known as the Watseka Wonder.
And I haven't heard
And
of this. I don't know.
really? Okay. It's
This is,
super interesting story. And again, these are one where we're just like skimming the surface. We're barely
yes.
raking the leaves off this dirt here. And so there's plenty of meat to get into these if anybody's interested in looking into it more, if it intrigues you. So, 1889, 1890-ish. There was I'm gonna be dropping some names here, so if you get kind of lost, just let me know. We'll come back around to it and explain it.
I'm with it.
There's Winchester Stevens was a spiritualist physician, and they first reported on this case known as the Watseka Wonder. And so there was a child named Larancy Venom. She became ill, and the family was concerned she was going to have to be institutionalized. The author of this report, Stevens, was recommended by a friend of a friend of the doctor and a friend of the girl who's sick. And so the friend, his name is Asa Roth. And so Stevens was sympathetic to this situation because his own daughter Mary had died 10 years earlier from a similar condition to what Larancy was suffering. There's even more. So as a spiritualist, he determined that Larancy was possessed by one or more troublesome spirits. And so they suggested that Larancy let a friendly spirit take over her body.
Okay.
And
Or you could get rid of them all.
you know, and so Larancy thought that might be a good idea, and that she was actually communing with several friendly spirits. And so one of them was the daughter of Asaroff. So the kind of go between that introduced the doctor to
Right.
the sick
Okay.
girl's family. Yeah. So her daughter had also died recently, and so basically they, upon the permission of the girl and kind of influence from the doctor, they basically told Mary Roth's consciousness to take over Larancy's body for a period of time. And so they let that happen, and when she was doing it, they she would act like her real parents. Like she was cordial with them and friendly, but she wouldn't act like they were her real parents.
Ah,
She called the parents of the dead girl. She called them by their nicknames and stuff like that, and basically went to live with this other family. It's
that's a
like
little rough.
such a weird kind of thing to think about, where it's like you're especially now as a dad of it's like you have this kid and then they're sick, but then you let somebody else's spirit take them over, and then you're like, okay, yeah, you can just go live with your other family for now while you're possessing the body of my
On all
kid. What?
sides of that, it's like the parents letting their kid go live with them is reinforcing that too. But also, is it like,
Mm-hmm.
was that a plot? Was it planned? Like, hey,
Yeah.
you have a living daughter. Like, interesting.
So it was for only a short period of time, and I don't think they like necessarily planned it out beforehand, but I think they kind of said, "Hey, why don't you come step in for a couple months?" And so basically, it lasted 3 months and 10 days, with a few breaks in between. Like the Lorancy would come back intermittently, but it was mostly this Mary Roth for almost 3.5 months. And yeah, so I mean, there is just so much to this story, and so many ways that it is kind of proven to be more than just like some kind of LARP, essentially, But
Yeah.
it's super interesting, and it just is a story that could definitely be. Probably should have pulled out a few more of the juicy points here, but it was just basically this girl took over her body and was living in it for a while till they
Yeah.
decided she could go. And then I guess the kind of cherry on top is that after Mary Roth left Lorancy's body, she was free from the afflictions that she had been
Okay.
suffering from before.
Interesting. Yeah. Got that spirit sickness.
Mm-hmm.
Man, you gotta like lock up your body when you leave it. Always lock your door.
I mean, I'm going back to like that last episode we were talking about. We got to keep that, some nice crystals charged up from the sun, and
That's right.
circle of salt around you.
Just always sleep in a circle of salt. You never
Yeah,
know.
yeah. My wife gets tired of the grittiness on her feet, but I tell her it's worth it. Believe
It's
me.
worth it. You haven't been possessed by a dead child recently, have you? Must be working.
So yeah, that's the Watseka Wonder case, and it's just pretty wild to think that this gal can be dead for a period of time, come back, and then possess another person's body. And I mean, that's a heck of a time to give the family to kind of get used to the idea of your
Yeah,
daughter really being gone. It's just a wild story.
it's a good one. And
And so I just kind of, with that, if consciousness can live on, go on and wonder about, is there any other way that this, I mean, it's hard to even describe, but it's like, can these spirits, can these consciousnesses, can they communicate with us in other ways? They can possess us. They can,
can we make
reincarnate.
contact?
How
Yeah.
do we, and how does that work?
I'm intrigued by
And
it. I'm
yeah,
intrigued.
one of the,
In the past I've always thought like, ghosts. I'm not like a spooky ghost video watcher. I don't like get into the like haunting cases that much. But the more we hone in on this idea of like consciousness being the center of all these experiences, the more I'm intrigued by it. I want to know more.
Yeah. And I'm kind of the same way where that's not definitely something that I do a lot of research on, but there are some cases that I find pretty interesting and pretty intriguing. And yeah, pump myself up, I did watch a couple little clips of ghost adventures there.
There you go.
So come at me, ghost. But one of the things one of the ways that has been purported that these ghost consciousness other they communicate with us is called instrumental transcommunication, and this was on that list of the 9 ways that you can kind of prove that there's some sort of consciousness after death, some life after death. And so it's ITC, instrumental trans communication. And it's basically any means of using equipment, usually electronics, to communicate with spirits, the dead, or any other non human intelligence. You can, use it for, other communication with other kind of.
Would that include like spirit box and EVP sessions and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, you'll most commonly see this in ghost shows with EVP methods and machines. Usually they involve like a white noise machine or some kind of recorder that has a really high noise floor. Then you'll kind of speak questions or comments or provocations. They're spoken aloud, come at me, ghost. And while the recorder is running, the noise kind of creates a canvas to manipulate from the other side, or the diaphragm on the microphone, or there's different ideas about how it actually manifests, but it's interesting to think about. And then you play the recording back, and you can hear the questions being spoken aloud, but also what seem to be responses.
Some of the ghost adventures like and shows like that bug me with how much weight they put on like the specific message being related by an EVP, because it's like already fascinating that there is anything recognizable as a voice in that situation. What bothers me is like the literal translation of it on the screen.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like, how did you pick that out? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Go eat a hot dog.
Yeah, exactly. How did you know?
It just told me I'm so hungry right now.
Maybe you're just thinking about hot dogs, man.
Yeah. So there's this woman named Annabella Cardoso, and she has a unique method of instrumental trans communication. She's written several books on it, and she was a career diplomat, Portuguese diplomat. So her method is called direct radio voice, and involves tuning a radio to a government station that is used for emergencies. So it usually just has white noise playing on it, and when voices appear, she can actually have two-way communication with them, and again go back and forth.
Ooh.
Which is an interesting.
That's wacky.
And yeah, people have witnessed this, and there's recordings of it, and she can apparently, it kind of goes back and forth, even though she doesn't have any way of transmitting on radio. It's just she's able to get back and forth.
Yeah,
with
right.
it.
Like she's just like she's just listening, but she can communicate out as well. It's not like CB, but yeah, weird. Okay.
Yeah. And then have you ever heard of this other way to do it? Have you ever heard of the Estes method?
That sounds familiar. I don't know. Remind me. Yeah.
So it's been talked about in kind of more recent, paranormal circles and things like that. I first remember seeing it mostly in Hellier. That was kind of this limited series by Greg and Dana Newkirk, who are kind of paranormal researcher type folks. They have like the Haunted Objects Museum and traveling paranormal thing. So they had a couple cool series called Hellier, but but it was mostly developed by these other guys who would go stay in the Stanley Hotel,
Oh yeah.
the haunted one that wasn't the Shining film there,
Yes.
or based
Well,
off
it
that.
was the inspiration for The Shining, right?
The
They like created
inspiration
their
for
own
it, yeah.
soundstage, but yep, totally.
So I think that's in Estes Park, and so that's why it's called the Estes method. But these guys would go in there, and it involves basically a team of 2 or more people. One person is acting as a receiver, and so they completely cover their eyes, usually with like a blindfold or whatever. And then you get noise canceling headphones on, and you put on some earbuds underneath it or something that are connected to this radio device. And so it'll be
Huh.
on a cyclic basis, it'll be picking and going through random radio stations, and so you hear all these different like choppy radio signals, and so then there's a person outside of that, just hanging out in the dark room or whatever, and that's where you got your Bud Baggins, and he's telling the Goat Man, yelling some provocation at the Goat Man. And then the Goat Man is talking to you through the radio signals that come through. And so it's pretty interesting when you see it recorded, because there's somebody outside or a group of people out here asking questions. And then there's a person who's with the blindfold, got their senses deprived. And so they will speak aloud anything that they audibly capture through these radio transmissions. And so they're not really supposed to know that the questions are being asked out here.
Gotcha.
But then sometimes they will
okay.
have answers for what the question is,
That must be
and
so
sort of-
disorienting, right? Besides anything else.
Yeah. And so it does get interesting when you got like kind of a hot session and it seems like there is interaction. Like you'll hear the people asking questions, and then all of a sudden the person will blurt forth, something that correlates to it. And it's just most often they are kind of ghost hunting, and it's not, necessarily this consciousness after death, but how does that all tie in? Sometimes it, is in these places of high emotional stress or lots of deaths. And, it could be some kind of consciousness trapped there. And like, how does this all play into it in these different methods of communication?
When it's recognizable messages, it's intriguing beyond just like, a single word that's open to
That
interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah. The Estes method is pretty interesting when you see a good session, like I said, because you can definitely, it feels like there's back and forth there, and it's something to talk about. But one of my favorite ones is this classic book, Phone Calls from the Dead. So all you youngsters out there maybe don't remember when our phones was plugged into the wall. But back in my day, I had to press the buttons and remember the phone numbers.
Did you ever have a rotary dial telephone? A friend of mine did. I actually made calls on a rotary telephone.
Yeah, I had seen it too. I've used them a couple times too. Yeah, it sucks when you get like 6 numbers through it and then you press the wrong one.
Yeah.
And you got to restart. But yeah, so this one, Phone Calls from the Dead. It is interesting that these most often did happen on those old school analog phones. I just wonder if there's something to that where it's like easier for
like
them
the infrastructure of it, like these things stretching literally everywhere across the planet and like into our houses. Like it's like if you're talking about it in some form of like electronic interference from the dead.
Yeah.
Like
or like maybe even like the larger format, like the wires and things, like maybe like that made it easier for this other side to manipulate the inductance of the electricity or however they do it. Maybe the platforms are so small now. I just throwing it out there. Who knows? But it's
I
Interesting to
haven't
think about.
I haven't yet heard of tweets from the dead, so you might have
Well,
something there.
you know, hold on to your little thought there, the partner. Come on back around to that. So this book, Phone Calls from the Dead, classic. You know, most people in this kind of topic know about this book. It's covered in my essay as well. It's by D. Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayless. And I just first read this book in the past year or so. We might even be able to find a link to the PDF on archive.org or something, because I think it is out of print nowadays. And it's awesome to think about, you know, spirits or consciousness being able to make phone calls. And
And there are a lot of cases of this. I'm familiar with this book too. And yeah, there's a ton of examples of people getting phone calls from the dead.
yeah. And I guess go back to my little joke here. I guess this kind of sucks for the younger generations, because seems ghosts can use analog phones better than they could.
Ha! Take that, Zoomers.
But so there's a bunch of great cases in this, but kind of like you were talking about, they kind of follow a framework. They kind of have features to them. So I was just going to kind of run down kind of like a basic way that these phone calls kind of play out. And so, you know,
Oh,
hello? A person gets a call from someone close to them. You know, it usually takes place before they know the person who is calling is dead, or it's like in enough time has passed, or it's in a moment that they kind of forget that the person is dead, and they kind of are just kind of happy to talk. Usually. Most of the calls are short, but not always. You know, some of them are like a half an hour, which is
wow.
crazy
Okay.
to think about. The caller usually convinces the receiver, so the spirit usually convinces the person taking the call that it's them by using a nickname, or relaying some other piece of like kind of small information that just makes
Something
them think, okay,
recognizable. Yeah.
yeah, nobody else would know that I call my dog Bippy Squicks or whatever, you know, and they're, you know, just have some kind of interesting thing where it's like it couldn't be any other person than, you know, mom or whatever it is.
Mima. Yeah.
And so the phone calls they're sometimes staticky, or like they have a bad connection, and they often kind of fade out, and the caller, you know, otherwise indicates, you know, that the communication is strained, you know, like they kind of have a hard time hearing them, you know, one way or the other, and the person says, "What? I can't hear you."
You're transporting me there. I can picture it all. I'm seeing the scene. Yeah.
So and then usually if the recipient of the call contacts the operator, they have no record of a connection being made to that number. And then so they get off the phone, they realize, wait a second, you know, that could have been great uncle because he's dead. Or they'll get notified a short time later that, hey, you know, Uncle Billy Bob, you know, he passed in the night, and, you know, he's like, oh my gosh, that's when I got my phone call.
Dun dun dun.
Yeah. So the authors do kind of, you know, have a theory that, you know, it could be like a psychokinetic effect. It could be like PK from the
Sure.
person receiving the call. But that doesn't make a lot of sense in the cases when they don't even realize they're dead.
Right.
And most of these cases also take place when the person is almost in a trance state, or kind of in a meditative mind frame where it's not like they're actively thinking about the deceased person. It just, I
Yeah.
wonder if like them being in that state helps helps the other side reach through on this phone call. And it kind of also had me thinking about, I made a joke about, people not knowing how to use analog phones these days, but it's also with our schedules. Nowadays we're so busy, always driving from here to there, work, email, social media. We're watching shorts on YouTube. Check out Anomaly Detected podcast. And don't be falling for any of these fake Anomaly Detected podcasts out there.
The
You got to
one
come to
true
the real
Anomaly
one.
Detected podcast. That's right.
But I'm almost kind of wondering, as I kind of came to the end of this section, if us just being bombarded by it so much, if we're not able to get into that kind of trance state in the same way
Yeah.
that would allow these phone calls to come through. And, because it's not really a trance state. It's just kind of a way to like able to like zone out for a second, or, be almost taking a nap, it
I'm
just...
I'm really pleased you brought that all up. It really, if you don't mind me jumping in, I
Nope.
have a bit of personal experience to relate, and it fits precisely with what you're talking about. And I honestly hesitated whether or not I should throw this into the show, because it is like a really personal story that I haven't shared outside of, say, my friends and family. But that's what this is all about, right? Is listening to these. We wouldn't have a show if people weren't willing to share their stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're talking about like people being contacted in a meditative state, or this not being able to occur because of modern day distractions. Well, so this happened to me about 5 years ago. I was going through therapy, and my therapist was getting me to meditate. I have a history of meditation. I used to meditate a lot, go to classes, practice it. Fell out of practice a long time ago, but so I was getting back into it at the suggestion of my therapist, and I was having a lot of trouble. I was very distracted internally. I was working on quieting my thoughts. I was in a quiet space alone in my room, and I felt like I was getting there. I managed to reduce the chatter internally, sort of pick apart my thoughts. And as I really reached what I would consider an actual meditative state, I was contacted by my deceased friend, and he had died about a year before that. And I say contacted as he just became a presence there in the room with me when, like I said, he had died a year before that, but that's a long enough time where you're not thinking about the person all the time. I was not thinking about my friend leading up to that. That was not part of any of the reason why I was in therapy. That wasn't part of my daily experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I quieted my thoughts enough. He showed up, and to add to that, like in that period of time, we had drifted apart from that friend group. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but there were multiple deaths that like sort of put a strain on that entire friend group, and just other factors that helped us grow apart, including drugs. Some of the people were taking drugs, and we knew that and weren't comfortable with it. And so it was sort of not really a decision, just like we grew apart, right? And weren't hanging out with these people. So my friend's widow came to mind, the friend who contacted me. And so later that same day, I talked to my wife, and I brought her up, and I was like, we haven't been seeing them. We don't know how she's doing. I feel like maybe we should contact her. But also, should we just make the decision now to cut ties with them? And not allow that really it's like the drug use chaos into our lives anymore, right? Well, we talked about it, and that is what we decided, to make the effort to not get involved in their lives, despite, the fact of like she's a grieving widow.
Mm-hmm.
And the very next day after that happened, I was told by a mutual friend that she was found dead of an overdose that day. So the previous day I'd been contacted by him, brought her to mind. Next day she was dead.
Mm-hmm.
And I can only assume that my friend was trying to contact her by way of me as like the antenna for that. And I don't I don't regret not contacting her, because what could I have done to change that trajectory? It wouldn't have
Yeah.
changed whether I had contacted her or not. And I think I made the best choice for me and my family at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But again, incredibly personal account, but you have to take my word for it. They're as real as you or I talking here, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting to think about, and another kind of idea that I come back to on these subjects, where I feel like in this circumstance, your meditation and your focus was kind of the binding light, the draw in from the other side, and it kind of being internal to you creates some enough plausible deniability for people that it's able to
True.
manifest in that way. Like I feel like the other side, it needs that. And so like in these other methods that we're talking about, it's kind of this white noise, it's these radio static, it's this jumping around, where this is the clay that it's molding. And as you said before, where it's like they put down, oh my God, she talked about the green shoes in this EVP, and then that's all you can hear is them talking about the green shoes. But in reality, it's
Right.
and it says go get a
And
Chicago hot dog.
and so it's like that difference between like, yeah, the internal experience and the external experience. But there's like, yeah, it's like the person's, in this case, in my story, my consciousness being like the telephone receiver. You know what
Mm-hmm.
I mean? Like, but yeah, or yeah, exactly. And I mean, there's a long history of that, right? Of people being the receiver of these communications. The human instrument being the
Yeah.
receiver of communications from the dead.
Well, in so many of these cases, what is commonly called mediumship is I've always kind of had a hard time with a lot of these cases. And because and
Overcoming the believability of it.
yeah, and there is that, especially kind of like you were talking about earlier, where it's like there's it's easy to cast doubt. It's easier to cast doubt on some of these cases that are older.
Yeah.
And
And mediumship's gone
so,
out of style a little bit, I feel like.
it has and anymore, but then on the other hand, it hasn't, because I think you can still find those people on YouTube doing, those light languages, doing,
Oh
the
man, you're right,
all
really.
these other kind of things where they're talking about, where it's like, or even your boy Chris Bledsoe,
Yep.
what in a lot of ways he's kind of facilitating that in a way.
Can I just, as an aside, like I think the more and more I hear about Chris Bledsoe, we did the episode, I've put out some videos, I've talked to some people, I've looked at his social media. I think he's full of shit, honestly. I think
Yeah.
Chris Bledsoe's kind of full of shit in a
I
major
well,
way.
we we had all, yeah. There's a few of the folks that I thought we might get into that a little bit more on that
Yeah.
episode, but yeah,
Allegedly
there's
full of shit.
uh, yeah, well, it's so interesting, and I mean, we'll see with these predictions coming up
Yeah,
what
yeah.
comes up with it. So
Yeah.
we'll wait till October to make that call,
That's
100%.
right.
But with this mediumship, there are some really interesting cases. There's this one that is called "Surgeon from Another World," and so it's this book, and it's about the George Chapman / William Lang case. And so William Lang was a prominent ophthalmic surgeon in London, and he died in 1937. George Chapman was a military veteran, boxer, and firefighter. So then several decades later, so they have obviously, completely different skill sets.
Yeah.
They're not, one, especially the boxer and firefighter, couldn't fake some of this stuff that this guy has
Vast difference in the level of education. Like, yeah.
Yep. And so basically in 1946, this military veteran, boxer, firefighter, George Chapman, he started channeling this Dr. Lang. And so this is 1937 and 1946. So it's like 9 years after this guy is dead. And he starts channeling this guy. And it became like basically a relationship that lasted 6 decades until George Chapman's death in 2006. So very recent.
Yeah.
From 1946 to 2006. 6 decades.
That's quite a run. Yeah.
And so he would enter these trance states, and he said he would not be aware of what Lang, the doctor, was doing. Sometimes these trance states would last 6 or more hours. There were witnesses to these events. There were doctors that would swear by it, and they would send patients to this guy. And I only read the essay. I didn't look into it further. I don't think he was doing actual surgeries, but he was still like helping people. But I forget.
My first question. Yeah.
I could be mistaken.
Maybe it was like
an
Edgar Casey style diagnosing people, and like then it's on you. Like, yeah, but yeah.
So, I mean, patients, family members, and medical colleagues would confirm that it was the doctor, the deceased doctor. He would have the same memories, speaking style, professional knowledge, and mannerism of the deceased. The people would interact with the channeled Lang. They were amazed with the differences in personalities between the two, between Chapman and Lang. The family would hold seances with Chapman and their dad.
There you go.
And they were convinced that the events were authentic, that were happening. And he would actually heal people in these states. And doctors that were familiar would send patients over. So in one event, Lang's granddaughter, she had 3 of her grandpa's objects they were just placed around the house. And they invited Chapman over, and he channeled her grandpa, and he just walked around the house and was like, "Oh yeah, this is my special pen. This is, I don't know what the objects were, but he was able to just walk around and be like boop boop boop, and those were the 3 correct.
There's something to our like consciousness tied to the objects that occupy the space around us. Like, yeah, we like imbue this. I don't know the answer, but like we imbue this importance on objects, and it somehow is like retained in the material. Mm-hmm. Like, it really seems like that's the case to me.
Yeah. And does that happen to all these little trinkets we have, leaving microplastics everywhere? So now we have a hard time with it. That's why we're so distracted, because you're just focusing on all these little microparticles that are just all over.
Interesting, yeah.
I
Yeah.
just, but so there's a couple of interesting cases on this mediumship, and there's one other one that I just thought was pretty fun, a pretty good case to go over, and I'm gonna do my best with this one because the names are not of my native tongue.
Uh-oh, pronunciation incoming.
But so this is the Morozzi and Korchnoi chess match, and so Giza Morozzi, he was the second best chess player in the world circa 1905, but he
Okay.
died in 1951. Years later, Viktor Korochnoi, he was the second ranked chess player in 1980. So a couple years after that, he actually did become the best chess player in the world, apparently. But so a couple years after that, I think it was 1987 to 1993 or something. It was like a 6 year match that these two guys played. So
Oh,
basically,
holy cow, right. Yeah.
so through a medium, the two chess masters played a game that lasted over 6 years, though one of the players had been dead for 3 decades.
And wow, okay. I'm here. I'm listening.
So yeah, so basically this medium would come in and he was given a selection of different dead chess masters to try and contact, and this guy Giza came to him, and so they played a chess game. Apparently his opening move, as the medium's opening move, or as Morozzi, he played a weak move that was for the time period. But when people looked back at it, it was actually considered the best known move for that situation in 1905 when he was a chess master.
Gotcha.
And so that points to the fact that this is, somebody actually taking over. The medium was not very familiar with chess and was given kind of the standard move breakdowns, like the B5, whatever. I don't even know it that well, but it's like a grid system and they have different symbols. And so it's like a chess shorthand. So he was taught how to do that and basic moves, but he wasn't really a chess player. And there were also a series of questions that were answered through the medium, and he got 79 of 81 correct. And so that's over 97% accuracy. And they were kind of obscure questions about the chess master's life and things of that nature that they did their best to kind of
Ask me
line
that
out
many
that
questions about my own life, I might get some wrong.
dude, I'm telling you, yeah. And so then there were chess masters who had studied the game that was played, and they say that there is a style and a kind of personality that came through in the moves. And so they believe that it was Morozzi taking over or playing chess through this medium. And the modern guy did eventually win, but it was a 6 year game.
And then that's major bragging rights. I I beat I beat a dead man at chess. Hell yeah. But man, so bam, proved it.
Well, I mean,
Chess.
and it's, I feel like we're just scratching the surface of so many of these stories, and we could really like dive into any one of them, and they had a lot of really interesting points to them that prove more thoroughly that there is something going on and there is something to be said for consciousness surviving after bodily death.
I don't think that we can necessarily define what happens to consciousness after death, after physical death, without defining consciousness, and we may never be able to do that. But I think certainly in many of these cases, there is some amount of evidence that part of our consciousness does go on past the point of physical death,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that was kind of one of my main breakdowns from this is essentially just a bunch of questions because, yeah, it's like, where does consciousness come from?
Yep.
Is it within and we're just tied into the system? Is it without and it's beamed in? Does it freaking matter? I mean, yeah, how are we connected in this web? And, how are people
I'm
getting information and
I'm going to
these esoteric
continue
ways?
to stand by my statement that I don't really believe in anything too completely. I don't have any very closely held beliefs on most topics, but I'm also going to put it out there that I feel like we can somehow connect to the collective unconscious, and that gets talked about, with Carl Jung and other people. But is the collective unconscious really just collective consciousness? Are we
Mm-hmm.
receiving one part of a collective whole, manifesting as us, our personality, and our consciousness? It's possible. It is
Max Planck.
possible.
Max Planck has an interesting quote about this kind of stuff, and he says, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. So he kind of is of the idea that, like, yeah, it's like, it goes both ways where material
I
formulates
love that.
consciousness, but consciousness can't, it's like
It's a
ends up
great
kind of being a
quote.
chicken or the egg kind of
Yeah.
situation.
And yeah, I could see it. I could see our physical being growing from consciousness as the seed. Absolutely. Um, or we're just meat sacks on a rock orbiting a star. Which,
That's it.
yeah.
Got a couple electrons dinging in my head,
Yeah,
and I'm worried
exactly.
about what my crypto's doing.
That's right. Um, this has been awesome talking to you about these deep topics, dude. And we've chatted about a lot of this stuff already, but this is getting down to the meat and potatoes of what makes us who we are and how this all
Yeah.
works. So glad to
Well,
discuss this stuff with you today.
well, we got right into it today. We didn't even say that, we're the Anomaly Detected podcast. We did have the sweet overlays.
Yeah, dude.
This is Jack Valley. I'm
Oh, right there.
Rick Nedfern
We're gonna
at
have
your
to
service.
we're gonna have to dive into this Caspar thing at some point too. But that's for another show. And you can
Definitely.
view all of our shows right here, all the episodes of the podcast. Like and subscribe. Hit that notification button.